Well, hello, Chris, and happy middle of 2026 to you. Somehow, here we are already. Got any big plans to celebrate America 250 this weekend?
Just the usual, little grilling. Typically have the family over for a little 4th of July party. So be interesting to see how easy it's going to be to prepare this year now with the second little man in the house.
Oh, yeah.
So, life just gets more and more hectic, but it should be fun. I'm looking forward to that. But how about you?
Oh, the same. Life is always getting a little more hectic. I think we're going to go try and see the it's not this weekend coming for the 4th, but in honor of the 4th, have you heard about the Big Boy locomotive on its cross country tour? Yeah. So it's going to be coming not too far from here on the main line Norfolk Southern tracks, around like Derry, Latrobe, Greensburg, not terribly far from you even. So
my neck of the woods.
Yeah, so we're gonna go next weekend. I think it's the 11th. We'll go do that. But other than that, your standard picnic and pool stuff for sure. It's just weird. I have to keep reminding myself. Yes, this is a sesquicentennial year. It just doesn't feel like it. Maybe with everything else in life going on, but.
Yeah, I was going to say, it depends on where you are. I've been around my neck of the woods. There's like a ton of flags up, a lot of business advertisements, out on their billboards and stuff. So everyone's making a pretty big deal about it. So yeah, I'm kind of interested to see, because that's with the little ones, like, when the sun goes down, they're going down. So it's kind of hard to make it out to like the big fireworks displays, but we're fortunate to be seated in a neighborhood area where we can kind of like see a nice panoramic of the area. So I'm interested to see if there's going to be like bigger firework displays that we can see from our house, than we have in the past. So I'm going to be keeping my eyes open for that. I did just see though that, and I don't fact check me on this, but apparently Pittsburgh was ranked number 1 in the nation for firework displays for the 4th. Okay. Now I don't know who said that. It was one of those titles you see and you just keep moving on. Yeah. But I did think that was pretty cool. So shout out to, who is it? Zambelli.
Actually, I saw an article the other day. It's I think the Starfire Corporation of Northern Cambria, Pennsylvania, is actually doing the fireworks in Pittsburgh this year. I don't fact check me on that. Yeah, but I saw that because I thought Zambelli was the go-to. I mean, obviously for the pirate names, but I thought they handled, that was just the default for all the big Pittsburgh celebrations. But no, I saw something about
shout out to the small town,
Exactly. That's where we're from. Right. Shout out to Cambria County, right? But
amen.
That's a podcast there for you. But, I had to tie it into what we're going to talk about today. When you think about the 4th of July, you're thinking about all that delicious, high calorie picnic food in honor of America's 250th birthday, potato salad, all the grilled meats, all that. But it kind of tangentially reminds me of high cholesterol and blood fats, specifically LDL and triglycerides. And that, of course, means that I'm talking about dyslipidemia. That's a condition that puts patients at higher risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke. And as we'll find out today, it's a condition that is a big problem in correctional settings. Chris, you're going to break everything down about dyslipidemia, its correctional health, the unique correctional health demands of it, and you're going to discuss some important new treatment guidelines that clinicians will definitely want to become familiar with. So before we get into that, of course, the usual production notes here. This is Podcast RX with Chris Bender. It's a monthly podcast from Diamond Pharmacy and the Optics team. I am Adam Campbell. I'm a member of Diamond's marketing staff, and Chris, of course, is a board-certified ambulatory care pharmacist with the Optics team. You can find this show in all the usual places one finds podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, etc. Please rate and review the show where you can to help us get into more earbuds. And full show notes for every episode can be found at diamondpharmacy.com/blog. And if you want to learn more about the work of Chris and the Optics Clinical Pharmacy team, please visit their website, opticsclinical.com. And of course, speaking of clinical, Chris, what are the most important medication headlines we need to be aware of in July of 2026?
I got a nice little smattering for you here for your backyard barbecue. So the first one, this one's for the resistant hypertension crowd. Baxfendy is the brand name for Baxdrostat, which is a brand new aldosterone synthase inhibitor. Basically, it shuts down the last step of aldosterone production, so it lowers blood pressure without dragging along the sex hormone side effects that you would get with something like spironolactone. Phase 3 data showed solid systolic blood pressure drops of somewhere around 9 to 10 millimeters of mercury, depending on the dose that was used, especially in those patients with high baseline aldosterone or renin. Now, the catch here is potassium. Don't need to keep an eye on that. Same as any drug that would be touching the aldosterone pathway, like spironolactone again. For our population, I definitely watch this one for patients who've failed the usual 3-drug regimen, that being a regimen that includes an ACE inhibitor or an ARB, calcium channel blocker, as well as a thiazide diuretic, as well as, and especially for anyone with suspected primary aldosteronism. Now, the second one is a big one for diabetes. So Novo Nordisk has announced that their previous oral semaglutide tablet, Rybelsus, will be retired in the US and will be replaced by their newer version, which is branded simply as Ozempic, in 1.5, 4, and 9 milligram strengths. So I want to note here that these are lower strengths than the 3, 7, and 14 milligram Rybelsus tablets, but the improved Ozempic formulation results in comparable plasma levels. Now, effectively, just to make sure that listeners aren't as confused as I was about this product initially, these are essentially the same product. Both carry indications to treat type 2 diabetes, as well as to reduce the risk of cardiovascular events in adults with type 2 diabetes. And additionally, the administration requirements remain unchanged. So patients would need to take this fasting with at most 120 milliliters of water, at least 30 minutes before eating, drinking, or other medication. I do want to note that both products are still currently available. It's just one of those things where as the new brand comes online, the previous brand, they're just, using up the remaining supply. So for the meantime, patients can use either product. There is no reason to favor one product over the other. Third, we have Hepcludex, which is a generic name, bulevirtide. And this is genuinely a big deal. So the FDA gave accelerated approval to Hepcludex for chronic hepatitis delta. And it's the first and only approved treatment for HDV in the US at this time. So for folks who don't deal with this daily, hepatitis delta only shows up in patients who already have hepatitis B. And when it does, it's actually the nastiest form of viral hepatitis out there. So think like the fast track to cirrhosis and liver cancer. Now, obviously, given how much hepatitis B and C we manage in corrections, this is one to know exists, even if it's only a niche population. I forget the number off the top of my head, but I think across the United States there may be somewhere on the order of tens of thousands of individuals that this would be appropriate for, like 40,000 or 100,000, something like that. But regardless, in those who need it, it is definitely a very important lifeline to have. And then fourth and last, I want to talk a brief mention on orphines, which are an emerging synthetic opioid. These are a new class of synthetic opioids. Structurally, they have nothing to do with morphine or fentanyl, but rather they're piperidine benzimidazolones. That's a fun one to say. The one that's driving outbreaks right now at the street level is called cyclorphine. It's been identified in close to a dozen states, and it's estimated to be roughly 10 times more potent than fentanyl. One of the big things is that it's not yet on standard toxicology screens, so it's able to fly under the radar. For correctional health, this matters for intake screening as well as overdose response, because naloxone still works since the orphines are mu agonists, just like opioids. However, you may need to be giving more naloxone given the potency of these agents.
Cyclorphine sounds, it already has a name that as this becomes more, as people become more aware of it, that name's going to help because it's like cyclone.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good buzzwordy type of name. And, in doing research for this and other segments regarding that, it does seem like it's already pretty well in the public zeitgeist. So I'm glad to see that, because because of how potent it is, you need to use more. So I think more naloxone for rescue. And I think that's probably the most important point to drive home with that.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk dyslipidemia.
Since 2010, Sapphire Health has developed innovative corrections-driven electronic health record software for jails, prisons, and detention facilities. As a wholly owned subsidiary of Diamond Pharmacy Services, Sapphire has drawn upon 4 decades of correctional health expertise and the direct feedback of correctional health personnel to build an EHR best suited for the inherent complexities of jail and prison health settings. Sapphire's suite of EHR features are supported through customized implementation options, comprehensive training, and 24/7 in-house support to ensure security, reliability, and performance every step of the way. Ready to transform your correctional facility's healthcare from intake to discharge? Schedule a demo today at sapphirehealth.com. Let's return to Podcast RX with Chris Bender.
All right, Chris, so you were worried that the dyslipidemia might be too sedate a topic for listeners, perhaps because it's so common in adults. But the risks that come with having abnormal levels of fat in the blood should wake anyone up. So what are the essential facts about dyslipidemia that listeners need to know, from screenings to risk to treatment and everything in between?
Fair warning, but I promise, we'll do our best to keep this lively.
I know you will.
So dyslipidemia just means that your blood fats are kind of out of whack. So usually LDL cholesterol is running too high, sometimes triglycerides too high, HDL too low, or sometimes a combination of all three. The reason that it earns a whole episode, aside from the fact that there's been a recent guideline update, is really because it's basically silent until it isn't, right? So nobody feels their LDL creeping up, but it's quietly building plaque in their arteries for decades. And then one day that shows up as a heart attack or stroke with zero warning. It's one of the biggest modifiable drivers of cardiovascular disease that we have. So when it comes to screening, this is pretty easy. So just a lipid panel, either fasting or non-fasting these days, doesn't really matter which. And guidelines want most adults getting a baseline by their 20s, and then periodically after that, depending on their risk. But here's the thing that trips people up. The number on the lab results isn't telling the whole story. What actually drives the treatment decision is your overall cardiovascular risk. So things like age, blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, family history, kidney function, all of this factored together. Because the same LDL number can mean very different things for two different patients. And that risk-based thinking is really the backbone of everything that we're about to dig into.
Well, relative to the community, why is managing dyslipidemia in the correctional environment more difficult? What factors exist on a patient and system level that we need to consider?
Yeah, so there are a few things that stack up against us. So on the patient side, our patients tend to come in with higher baseline cardiovascular risk. Typically, we have more smoking history, more untreated hypertension and diabetes, less access to preventative care before incarceration. And then on the system side, diet is institutional. Exercise options are more limited, and formulary access to the newer non-statin agents are often restricted by cost. And then there's, of course, the continuity piece. So patients get transferred between facilities or released. And if we're being honest, lipid management is rarely anyone's top priority during any of those transitions. So therapy can get interrupted. It's a population that needs this care more, essentially with fewer of the tools to deliver it consistently.
Well, as you noted at the top of the discussion, the real inspiration for this episode came from a recently published report from the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association Joint Committee on Clinical Practice Guidelines for Dyslipidemia. I understand that this report introduces a new way of understanding cardiovascular risk in particular. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, this is really the engine under the hood, of the whole guideline. The big shift is a move away from the older calculators, which honestly hadn't been updated in a meaningful way in over a decade. And they're moving toward a tool called PREVENT, which stands for Predicting Risk of Cardiovascular Disease Events. It was developed by the American Heart Association, and it's a genuine upgrade for a few reasons. First, it estimates risk out to both 10 years and 30 years. So a 35-year-old patient with a great-looking 10-year number, but a concerning lifetime trajectory doesn't just get waved off, because you can actually see that risk building further into the future. Second, it pulls in kidney function and, where available, different things like urine albumin to creatinine ratio, and what I think is interesting, even the social deprivation index. So it's accounting for cardio kidney metabolic health more holistically instead of just heart disease in a vacuum. And third, and this is the part that has gotten some attention, it removed race as a variable in the calculation, since the data didn't support race itself being a biological risk driver the same way that older models implied. Now, once you run PREVENT, get a score for that patient. The guideline places primary prevention patients, meaning folks who haven't had an event yet, into low, borderline, intermediate, and high risk categories. And that tier is what determines how aggressive you get with LDL targets and whether you reach for a statin alone or you start layering on additional therapy.
So looking at this PREVENT framework, it sorts people into those low, borderline, intermediate, and high buckets. But what happens when someone genuinely lands in that fuzzy middle zone? Is there a tiebreaker?
Yeah, there is, and it's kind of a fun one. So it's known as coronary artery calcium scoring, or CAC. It's a quick, low radiation CT scan that literally counts the calcified plaque sitting in your coronary arteries right now, rather than estimating a potential future risk from a formula. So in a way, it is a direct measurement rather than a predicted measurement, which in medicine is always more of a gold standard type of thing. So the guideline leans on it specifically for that borderline or genuinely uncertain group where you're not sure whether to commit someone to a statin for the rest of their life. If the CAC score comes back with 0, no coronary calcium, that's a strong signal you can hold off on a statin and just recheck in a few years. It's basically giving you permission to de-escalate or omit therapy. But if it comes back elevated, that can reclassify the patient upward and tells you to treat more aggressively, even if their PREVENT score alone kind of looked borderline, because you have direct evidence that, hey, there's something building up in there. The honest caveat for us is access, unfortunately. CAC scoring isn't exactly walking distance in most correctional settings. So realistically, it's something you're coordinating through outside imaging or considering at intake if a patient's already had one. But it's worth knowing that it exists as a tool because it can cut both ways, both providing reassurance just as often as escalation. And one additional piece to add to this is that, even just, having a wife who's a provider in the community, this unfortunately is still something that is lagging behind in the community as well. So we're not alone in corrections. And this is simply because this is a test that is not routinely paid for through insurance. So this is mostly out of pocket for patients. It's not from my understanding, it's not the cheapest. It's not the most expensive either. But it's not something you would be getting in every single patient, which I believe is why the guidelines suggested this simply for those borderline patients.
Besides the risk considerations that you just took us through, the new guidelines also highlight apolipoprotein B as an important treatment target alongside LDL-C. This is abbreviated ApoB. Do you pronounce this like Applebee as I just did, or APOB? I don't know. Either way, why is ApoB or APOB important?
Now, I'm sure they don't. But I love the thought of this segment being brought to you by Applebee's and their new triple barbecue chicken kickers.
seems contradictory to what we're talking about here.
Contradictory, but it's a crazy enough marketing campaign that it just might work. Now accepting sponsors.
Yeah. Okay.
But jokes aside, I typically just say ApoB, or at least that's how I've heard people smarter than me say it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
But anyway, here's the actual science behind it. So LDL measures the amount of cholesterol cargo riding around inside your lipoprotein particles, but it doesn't tell you how many particles there actually are. ApoB, on the other hand, is a structural protein that sits on every single atherogenic particle. So LDL, VLDL, IDL, and Lp(a). So there's one ApoB molecule per particle. So it's effectively a direct particle count. And why does that matter clinically? Well, because two patients can show up with the exact same LDL of, let's say, 100, but one of them has fewer, larger, more cholesterol-stuffed particles, and the other has a swarm of small, dense, cholesterol-poor particles. So same LDL, very different number of particles bumping into artery walls and starting plaque. That second pattern is extremely common in patients with insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, or high triglycerides, which honestly describes a big chunk of our correctional population. The guideline actually sets specific ApoB thresholds now, generally under 70 milligrams per deciliter for higher risk primary prevention patients, and under 55 for those with established cardiovascular disease. And they actually recommend checking it specifically in patients with diabetes, obesity, or triglycerides over 150, because that's exactly the group where LDL alone tends to undersell the true risk. So it's just, as we like to say all the time on this podcast, it's another tool in our armamentarium to kind of parse out additional risk and find more patients that we need to treat more aggressively when we otherwise wouldn't have in the past.
Are there any other lab values beyond ApoB that are getting more attention?
Yeah. So I mentioned just as an aside in our last response, lipoprotein little a, written LP parentheses A. And this one's interesting because it behaves totally differently from everything else we've talked about. It's almost entirely genetically determined. It's basically at birth, and it doesn't really move with diet, exercise, or even statins, at least in the way that LDL does. The new guideline recommends checking it at least once in every adult because an elevated Lp(a) identifies a chunk of people whose actual cardiovascular risk is well above what their LDL or even their prevent score would suggest. Again, it's flagging risk that's otherwise invisible. For our population specifically, this might matter more than for the general public, honestly, because family history is so often incomplete or just unknown when someone comes in through intake. A single Lp(a) check can surface that hidden genetic risk even when you have zero family history to go on. The catch is that there's still not a dedicated Lp(a) lowering drug on the market. There are a few in late-stage trials, however. So today, a high Lp(a) mostly just means being more aggressive with the levers that you do have access to, like targeting LDL and ApoB.
Interesting how it acts as such a warning flag that way. Let's look at treatment for dyslipidemia. Now, we know that statins are the go-to medications for dyslipidemia. Have those guidelines led to, have the guidelines, the recent guidelines led to any major change in medication recommendations?
Well, statins are still very much the foundation. That hasn't changed and honestly shouldn't. That's because they're cheap. We have decades of safety data, and they're on basically every formulary on the planet. What has changed is how confidently and how early we use them and what target we're chasing once we start. So let's walk through it by category because this is where it actually starts to get useful. So for primary prevention, meaning patients who haven't had a heart attack or stroke yet, once you've run that prevent score that we talked about, Low risk patients mostly just get lifestyle counseling and a recheck down the road. For borderline risk patients, it becomes a shared decision-making conversation. Often this nudged in the favor of statins by patients having risk-enhancing factors like family history or a high ApoB or coronary artery calcium score if you happen to have access to that. Intermediate risk patients are where moderate intensity statin therapy becomes the default recommendation. Generally, we're targeting an LDL under 100 for these patients. And high risk primary prevention patients, think uncontrolled diabetes plus other risk factors, or a prevent score of 10% or higher, these patients get pushed toward high intensity statin dosing with a goal of LDL under 70, which is notably more aggressive than we've seen in older guidance for that patient group. Then for secondary prevention, so these are patients who've already had an event. High intensity statin is the expectation from day one, with an LDL goal of less than 70 for those who are at not very high risk, and less than 55 for those who are at very high risk. Now, speaking, from my experience in reality, most secondary prevention patients are probably going to fall into the very high risk category, because if you think about it, this includes patients who either had multiple events or they had an event and they also have some, risk enhancing chronic disease like diabetes or chronic kidney disease. But I think suffice it to say, it's important to note here that even this goal of 55 is a little bit more aggressive than what other guidelines, at least American guidelines, have recommended for this patient population in the past. So not only are LDL goals back on the table with this guideline iteration, we're seeing more aggressive LDL goal guidelines with this iteration. But that being said, the medication class of statins itself, they haven't changed. What's changed is a much more granular, tiered, targeted system tied directly to that risk category instead of a more of a one-size-fits-all, get it under 100 type of approach.
A more focused armamentarium, basically.
Yeah.
So how about when statins aren't enough?
So that's where the add-on therapies come in. And the guidelines do a pretty good job of keeping a logical step pattern to it. So ezetimibe is almost always first, since it's generic, well tolerated, and adds maybe another 15 to 20% of LDL reduction on top of an already established statin. Think of it as like cheap insurance. If you're still not at goal, especially in that very high risk secondary prevention group, who, as a reminder, have an LDL target under 55, that's where PCSK9 inhibitors come in. So these are the injectables like evolocumab and alirocumab, which can drop LDL another 50 to 60%, which is truly a massive decrease. Bempedoic acid is also another major option, which is particularly useful for patients who are truly statin intolerant, since it works upstream in the same cholesterol synthesis pathway, but doesn't hit the muscle enzyme that causes statin-associated muscle symptoms. For correctional formulary specifically, ezetimibe is the easy one. It should really be on every formulary at this point because of all the things I mentioned before. But the PCSK9 agents and bempedoic acid are where you start to run into real cost and potential, formulary approval friction. So practically speaking, those tend to get reserved for your highest risk, statin maximized or intolerant patients who genuinely aren't hitting their goals any other way, which honestly lines up pretty well with how the guideline frames step therapy.
Well, you were talking about bempedoic acid as an alternative for statin intolerant patients, but how do you actually confirm someone is genuinely statin intolerant before you give up on the whole class?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because, the whole, I tried a statin once and my legs hurt, gets reported a lot more often than how often true statin intolerance actually occurs. There's a real nocebo effect at play where just expecting muscle aches actually makes people more likely to notice and report them. And, muscle aches and statins, those have been, that has been one of the most widely reported on in the media. I think everybody knows that when they're getting put on a statin. So they go into treatment with statins almost expecting it to happen. And then that really, therein lies a lot of the problem. So the workup matters before you write someone off statins entirely. The first step is just confirming the timing and the pattern. Did the symptoms actually start after the statin? Are they symmetric? Do they involve large muscle groups? That kind of thing. And checking a CK level to rule out true myopathy versus garden variety aches, because obviously if they're having true myopathies, they're going to see an elevated CK level as opposed to someone who just has plain muscle aches. And then from there, it's a structured trial. So try a lower dose of the statin, try a different statin entirely, since they're not all equally tolerated. Or heck, try an alternate day or twice weekly dosing with a longer acting statin like rosuvastatin or atorvastatin, which actually a lot of patients tolerate just fine, even when daily dosing bothered them. It's only after a couple of honest re-challenge attempts across different statins and schedules that you should really call it true intolerance and move to bempedoic acid or another non-statin path entirely. It's worth the extra step here because statins are still your most cost-effective tool, and a lot of quote-unquote intolerant patients are actually statin tolerant after all, once you find the right regimen. And one additional note is that for those who truly are statin intolerant, if you go through this process of finding, trying alternative drugs, alternate dosing schedules, when it comes time to make the case to have your request for, if you follow a formulary and a formulary review process, it often bolsters your case when you're ordering bempedoic acid to say to the medical director, hey, we have already tried all of the prerequisite steps. And at that point, there's no going back and forth. And it's like, okay, then we can approve the bempedoic acid. So not only are you helping your patient stay on the statin, you're also helping yourself moving forward from like a formulary approval perspective, if a non-statin is truly needed.
And a lot of built-in flexibility within that drug class. I didn't realize. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's really nice. There's a lot of latitude. So we're thankful for that.
Yeah. Well, most of this conversation has been about LDL and ApoB. What about triglycerides specifically?
Yeah, triglycerides are kind of their own animal. And honestly, given our patient's diet, metabolic profile, they really deserve their own spotlight. When triglycerides get severely elevated, and we're talking about above 500, sometimes way above that, the concern isn't really cardiovascular risk anymore. It's more about acute pancreatitis, which is a genuine medical emergency and a totally different urgency level than simply LDL management. So severe hypertriglyceridemia gets its own treatment pathway in the guidelines, separate from the statin conversation, with treatment relying on fibrates or prescription omega-3s first, plus aggressive dietary fat, alcohol restriction. But here's where I want to flag something because I still see this a lot. For that moderate range, that being persistently 150 to 499, fibrates and fish oil are not the answer, even though they keep getting reached for out of habit. Niacin and fibrates were tested specifically as statin add-ons for cardiovascular risk reduction in patients of that moderate range in trials like Accord Lipid, and they didn't move the needle on outcomes. No reduction in cardiovascular events. So for a patient on a statin with triglycerides sitting at, say, 220, adding a fibrate isn't supported by the evidence, and OTC fish oil doesn't have any outcomes data behind it at all. It's a supplement, not guideline-directed therapy. The actual first move in that range is making sure that the statin itself is maximized if it's indicated, since statins do meaningfully lower triglycerides as a side effect, or as a side benefit, I should say. And also, we want to make sure that we're addressing secondary causes. So uncontrolled diabetes, alcohol, certain medications, etc. Only after that, patients who are high risk and still have persistently elevated triglycerides despite a maximized statin, do we start to consider icosapent ethyl. And it matters that this is a purified EPA omega-3. So it's not the same thing as fish oil off the shelf. The Reduce It trial showed that icosapent ethyl actually reduces cardiovascular events on top of statin therapy in this specific population, which is why it earned a real guideline recommendation instead of just being lumped in with supplements. So the message for providers is really stop reaching for fibrates or fish oils as a reflex in that moderate range. Optimize the statin first and reserve icosapent ethyl for the patients who actually match the trial population in which it was studied. Those being high risk, persistently elevated triglycerides who are already on a maximized statin.
You know, with this very expansive conversation that we've had about dyslipidemia, the one thing to really remember is that this is a preventable condition. Healthier lifestyle choices, you know, just your classic diet and exercise can help or can stop dyslipidemia from happening. But of course, the corrections environment, as you said earlier, it doesn't exactly offer patients much choice in the diet and exercise areas. So how can correctional healthcare providers really influence change here?
Yeah, it really is a real constraint. I mean, there's no sugarcoating it here. But there is still room to move the needle, you know, working with your food service team on menu modifications, if and where that's possible, advising patients to make the most of whatever recreation and exercise access that exists. And frankly, just consistent patient education, because, you know, if you think about it, a lot of folks have never had a provider sit down and explain what their numbers actually mean. Another thing is tobacco cessation programming. This is probably the highest yield thing that we actually do control. And honestly, when lifestyle options are this limited, that's exactly the argument for not being shy about pharmacotherapy. Sure, you can't out-medicate a bad diet, but you also can't expect diet alone to do the job here.
Right. In your view, Chris, what are the primary takeaways from the new guidelines that correctional providers can put to work immediately?
So if I had to boil it down to a sticky note, one, actually run the prevent calculator instead of just eyeballing a patient's risk. It's quick, it's free, and it certainly changes the conversation, especially for your younger patients with a scary 30-year trajectory who'd otherwise get overlooked based on their 10-year score alone. Two, know your LDL targets by category. Under 100 for intermediate risk primary prevention, under 70 for high risk primary prevention, under 55 for very high risk secondary prevention. Because just getting it under 100 for everybody is genuinely outdated thinking now. Three, don't be shy about checking ApoB and a one-time LPL(a) in your diabetic, obese, or high triglyceride patients, or anyone with an unknown family history. Between the two of them, they catch that risk that LDL alone can miss entirely. Four, don't let a reported statin intolerance go unchallenged. Most of the time, there's still a statin dose or schedule that works once you actually work through it. And five, underneath all of it, under-treatment is still the bigger failure mode in our setting than over-treatment. So when in doubt, push the statin dose up before you start adding new agents.
Just to conclude this discussion, just general curiosity. I mean, given the freshness of the prevent guidelines, everything we've talked about today, I'm just curious how much discussion you've had with correctional health providers with optics about these guidelines.
Yeah, like you said, it's a little bit newer, so it's slower to get the ball rolling. But I've had more conversations than I had expected, honestly. I mean, it's come up in a handful of conversations and presentations that I've given to medical groups and teams. Heck, even the providers that I work with providing chronic care consults, we've already discussed this and we've already implemented prevent scoring rather than the previous pooled cohort equation. So I think it is kind of, the conversation is coming up more and more. And it's good to see that people are staying up to date with the guidelines. And obviously things like this, spreading the word, is certainly helping, like through the podcast and through the other media that we disseminate. But what I think is making these guidelines easier to adopt is that it's not a wholesale change. A lot of the guidelines do remain the same. The treatments, for the most part, remain the same from previous iterations. And we're getting back to numbers, which a lot of us were trained on. The previous iteration, two guidelines ago, back in what it was 2014 or 2013, I believe. Those had numbers, and we're used to seeing that. So I think it's making for a little bit of an easier change because we're kind of going back to what we're good at.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, this is a great way. This podcast is a great way to get those new guidelines out into the forefront. And I think you gave a lot of great information. So thanks for that wonderful breakdown, Chris.
And two, just to add to that, I've already done a deep dive into the guidelines and have put together a clinician pocket guide.
Oh, nice.
That distills the 150, 160 page guideline into what I want to say is like a 5 or 6 page pocket guide. It is posted and available on the Optics Clinical website, so opticsclinical.com. And to be honest with you, in my daily chronic care patients consults, I still routinely pull that thing up and reference it for my own sake. So I'd highly encourage those of you who are interested in learning more, seeing more of the nitty gritty, the numbers and all of the treatment algorithms and whatnot. I kind of have it all laid out for you there.
Excellent. Yeah, you've got now 2 resources. You've got this podcast, and then you can go more in depth with that tool. That's excellent. All right. We'll be right back after a quick break to talk more statins.
Institutional healthcare providers in corrections and long-term care. Do you wish you had easier access to clinical pharmacy resources and expertise? Well, Diamond's Optics team has launched opticsclinical.com, a new platform designed to connect physicians, nurses, and administrators with the medication expertise of Optics board-certified clinical pharmacists. Explore disease state webinars, on-demand clinical reference materials, and discover innovative technological solutions. Integrate the specialized knowledge of clinical pharmacists into your facility's healthcare team to solve clinical challenges, contain costs, and improve patient outcomes. Visit opticsclinical.com today and sign up for your free account. Now let's get back to Podcast RX with Chris Bender.
So as we discussed today, statins are the cornerstone pharmacotherapy for dyslipidemia. But the origin of statins as a drug class comes from an unexpected source, one you might associate more with, say, antibiotics. Chris, tell us about it.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite pharmacy origin stories. So statins actually come out of mold research. So there was a Japanese biochemist named Akira Endo was hunting for natural compounds that block cholesterol synthesis. And he kind of took inspiration from how Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin from a mold that happened to kill bacteria. So Endo screened thousands of fungal extracts in the early 1970s and eventually isolated a compound from the fungus Penicillium citrinum that inhibited HMG-CoA reductase, which is the rate-limiting enzyme in cholesterol production. That compound, mevastat, never actually made it to market, but it opened the door for lovastatin and the whole statin class that followed. So the next time you write a statin prescription, you can thank a mold scientist chasing the same idea that gave us antibiotics.
Would have never connected those 2 things, so that is incredibly interesting. Chris, I want to
Nature's amazing.
Yes, absolutely. Chris, I want to thank you so much. We're about to time here, so I've got a lot going on. I want to get out of your hair, but thank you so much for this very expansive discussion. I think you absolutely nailed the right mix of being clinical and keeping it fun, as you said at the beginning of the episode. So wonderful job.
Keep
there.
it light.
Yeah, keep it
light.
Keep it light.
And if you want more nitty gritty, head over to the website.
That's right. Happy 4th of July, Chris. Enjoy.
Happy 4th of July to you.
Yeah, and thank you so much, and enjoy where July takes you. And we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right. Take care. Podcast RX features conversations with healthcare professionals. The statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as the substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
Podcast RX is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. Find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you enjoy podcasts. And where possible, please rate and review. If you'd like to get in touch with the show directly, shoot us an email at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com. Thank you again for your support.